Alright, I was just trying to find a decent angle before we get started, and I realized I left my wall. Oh no, it's right there. Perfect. Okay. So, the plan today is going to be to read chapter 15 and then to go into a bit of a lore chat about some things that are both in the book and not in the book, which there is an entire section, there's actually 3 sections in the back of the book, which I will show the audience here. So after the epilogue, there is a section there you'll see called appendices. And what these essentially are intended to be kind of filling in the gaps for some stuff. They're meant to sort of provide a little bit of backdrop on the world and the characters' sort of like culture without being necessary for you to understand or enjoy the story. But if you're into lore and stuff, that's kind of one way to do it. I'm not going to read these sections. I mean, they're not long. But maybe I may end up reading them, but I'll probably just use it as a reference to kind of explain and articulate some of the like features that you'll find in the actual story as it relates to characters. Probably going to keep it specific to section 2, which is the Napoleon Empire, a brief overview. I may do the part that is the Kingdom of Angladeus, a brief overview as well, but we'll see kind of where we're at by that point. So, I'm going to read chapter 15. I'm going to shut down the streams so that people who only want to hear the live reading, and also so that when I create the video for the YouTube channel, people don't have to listen to the lore stuff if they don't want to. I don't think there's going to be anything. I don't anticipate anything being spoilery in the lore part, but it might be, and that way people can kind of avoid that if they want to. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few of the features of Scrivener and talk a little bit about how that works and the process that I do some writing. If people are in chat and want to ask questions at that stage, I will happily try to answer everything that I can. But I'm going to give you a little peek at the project that I call the Codex, which is sort of my attempt to build like a lore database for the book. So, yeah, that's the plan. So, chapter 15. In the previous chapters, a couple important developments. Ghost was confronted by Diaga, who recognized him as Greymane Squall. Now, easy to miss if you haven't been keeping up with the text so far. Greymane Squall is basically infamous for having opened the gates of Nepal City to Wolfbane and the Narathian army that now controls what used to be the Empire of Nepal, aka what most people refer to as the North. So, essentially, Diaga has figured out that Ghost is just the secret name of the greatest traitor in his country's history, and has agreed, at least for now, not to disclose that information to the rest of the group. The other thing that happened is that Vendile successfully, Carcyrus Vendile, one of the 8 High Lords of Angladeus, successfully deposed Arvadus Angladeus and had Geladan Wemmer, one of the other High Lords, send one of his trusted soldiers to execute Varasho Angladeus, who is Arvadus' eldest son. This primarily being out of fear that Varasho is going to cause trouble after the potentially not legal deposition of his father, or deposing, I guess would be the proper term, of his father. So, that brings us up to chapter 15. The companions stopped on the hill of broken wagons to survey the scene below. The town of Delmore was sizable, but not as large as Guylick Hill, and formed from tightly grouped houses that doubled as walls. It had no gates, just 3 gaps in the buildings, and where there was any barrier between the structures meant to slow incomers, it seemed half-hearted and poorly made. Trem speculated that these were more likely to contain wandering children and domesticated livestock than actually serve as a defense against assault. The buildings were wood and hard mud bricks, not as fine or well built as Guylick Hill. This was a rural town, a hub for farmers and herders, and a community for those who traded with them as well. Those who didn't live in the town limits likely were not far from them, for safety's sake. It was a typical and simple defensive country philosophy, and it stood no chance of resisting a full blown military assault. The town of Delmore looked to be in a state of utter panic. Carts were lined up facing the eastern road as though the populace intended to depart west as one long, desperate caravan. It was a mass emigration and it was badly organized. A few men were running around in tattered armor and carrying old bulky weapons, trying to get things moving in one direction, seemingly being overseen by a striking woman in brilliant white robes. There was an air of fear all over the town. People were running through the streets without purpose or any apparent reason for their actions. They simply were hurrying to get something done without any plan for how to do it efficiently. The travelers watched all the chaos in silence from the hilltop beneath a massive dead tree. Ghost took a pull from his water canteen and stared impassively at the terrified town. Wiping his mouth with the back of a glove, he eyed the party behind him. They bore mixed expressions, concern, grimness, but Trim had the oddest of all. It was an expression Ghost never expected to see from him. It was fear. Joven edged closer to the scene. They look like they're running from something. Grimtooth grunted. Aye, lad, and when it looks like running, then it probably means running. Indeed, agreed Logan. The real question is, what are they running from? The remark brought no response from the group as the answer had been provided in Guy-la-Kill, and through numerous rumors on the road. Ghost tucked his canteen away and gritted his teeth. Not our problem. Whatever is driving them out, they are choosing to leave, and we are choosing to enter. We let them be, and move on. Gend, where do we go from here? The halfling started in surprise and licked his lips. Well, once we're inside town, we turn southward and ride towards Silverleaf. Gend pointed to the gap in the fence to the right of their vantage point. We go through there and follow the road to its end. That will bring us to where the hills rise up among the trees, close enough to hear the far water striking the cliffs. From there, well, that is when the road goes underground. More than one head turned upon hearing the last word. Diaga, who had not been privy to this stage of the journey until now, was alarmed. Underground. Surely you can't mean the passage of Chronocarl, the one that goes beyond Sunhall. Yes, that is the name, Gend smiled. I'd quite forgotten. Diaga shook his head and said gravely, None have traveled that road in hundreds of years. The dwarves left the halls long ago, or so the legends say. There's been no contact with those beneath the ground in many lifetimes. We can't be sure there's anything left, and what may remain could be that which we do not want to encounter. I went through once and it wasn't so bad, Gend shrugged dismissively, and Wrath tells me he's gone that way as well. Logan turned to the black-clad figure, his body almost totally obscured by the folds of dark cloth. You've made the journey. Wrath tilted his head towards the Angadaik slightly. I've walked the road before night, yes. And it is safe? Wrath watched Logan a bit longer, then turned his gaze back on Delmore. Gend quickly interjected. Don't mind old Raincloud. It's safe, all right? Why'd I have to take a whole army through, too? Well, in a few parts at least. Not that I have, you know. Ghost glared at Gend, sternly remarking, We do not want an army with us, halfling. Gend waved his glower away with a laugh. Oh, don't worry, I'll seal the door behind us, if you really want me to, that is. Trem spoke softly. How do you know all this? The path, the door, everything. My family used to live nearby. Gend smiled that disarming smile again. An old dwarf was our neighbor and told all kinds of great adventure stories. That's how I started my own travels. One of the stories about that cavern just happened to be true. Trem nodded slowly, accepting the explanation. Javanaleth shifted in his saddle uncomfortably. Well, I suppose we ought to get into town then. Perhaps buy some supplies before we head for this passage. Ghost shook his head emphatically. If they're leaving for good, any supplies they have will be sold at high price, and besides, how long is this journey? About a week, perhaps a week and a half if the going is slow, Gend remarked. Then we'll not need any supplies. We can get them on the other side. With that, Ghost began riding towards the town, followed by Logan and Grimtooth. Wrath and Gend quickly fell in, but the others hesitated. This will end badly, muttered Diaga. Neep eyed him quizzically, and he glanced at her before smiling slightly. But only good men make quiet journeys. Great men make dangerous ones. Right, Neep? Neep meowed softly and started toward the town, her master in tow. Joven heard none of Diaga's musings, and neither did Trem. The boy sat stiff in his saddle, watching the panicked people run to and fro in the distance. He jerked when Trem placed a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right? Joven shook his head grimly. I have a terrible feeling about this place, Trem. Something dark is in the air. Trem eyed him carefully and spoke slowly. I'm not sure I get the same sense, Joven. Perhaps these people are in some danger. But it's not our concern. We move in and move on. They'll be all right. He smiled, then rode forward to join the others. Joven watched him go, perplexed. He sounded so much like Ghost, emotionless, even uncaring. Where was the man who'd been so moved by the refugees in Guy-la-Kill? Who are you? Joven asked after the departing figure, too softly for him to hear. But the only way for the young man to learn was to follow. Water. Renan Ordland was as good as his word. The riders reached the gates of Alderlast still under cover of darkness, just shy of dawn, and the guards on duty waved them through without hesitation. Once within the city, they took dark alleyways and back streets to reach the home of Arvadas Hawking. Their arrival came just before sunlight began to creep over the horizon. Varasho climbed down from his horse, tired but determined. He glanced at Renan, who stood calmly beside him, his guards arrayed stealthily around the house perimeter to watch for inquiring eyes. The soldier bowed low. I must take my leave and depart and report your demise to High Lord Bremer. I don't know if I'll be able to aid you further, but there is a house north of here, close to the marketplace. There'll be a small hawking banner hanging in the window. You can leave a message there, if need be. I'll send word of any developments in the palace if I am able. You've done me much service already, Renan. I thank you. Without another word, Renan leaped back on his horse and started towards the palace. Varasho hoped his lie would be enough to deter the soldiers of Vendile from scouring the city, but the false king had always been notoriously paranoid. Varasho turned to his father's house and quietly rapped the door. There was no response. Glancing around and pulling the hood he had worn since he entered the city closer around his head, Varasho knocked again a little louder. The door cracked open, and the grizzled head of Graham poked out. No visitors tonight. His Majesty is taken ill. Varasho removed his hood, saying, I hear he's more taken than ill. To the palace, I was told. Graham's eyebrows rose, and he shoved the door open. Get in here quickly, my prince, quickly. Varasho swept in, the door slammed shut behind him. Graham dropped the heavy door bar into place, jolting the young Derek from his brief slumber where he sat propped up by the wall in one corner of the room. Varasho noted that only one other in the entryway, a dark hooded figure that sat proudly at his father's table. Varasho moved to sit at his usual place, the chair to the right of his father's own. He eyed the figure beside him in an attempt to discern which of his family's loyal guards it might be, but soon realized it was no guard. Lena? The figure stood and removed her hood. Lena Engrove was a thin, fair-skinned woman with raven black hair and deep brown eyes, an intoxicating combination of pride and mystery lurking in them that had ensnared many men. One of those men Varasho knew particularly well. He stood and stepped cautiously toward her. Why are you here, Lena? Your father left you a note, Varasho, the young woman said quietly, gesturing to the small paper on the table. He believed he would be imprisoned in the dungeons by Vendile. He wanted you to know you might be in danger. Varasho shook his head and sighed. His warning reached me a bit late. Lena cocked her head slightly and looked questioningly at Varasho. The two had never been friends, but consequence often made them unwilling allies. Lena kept her palms on the heavy wooden table, and Varasho could not help but notice the Hawking family ring she still wore in her left hand. Do you wear it all the time? Varasho had not meant to ask the question so chidingly, and Lena's sharp look told him she was offended. He went ahead in a lecturing tone anyway. It's dangerous. I explained this to you. Why are you here? Lena crossed her arms in her velvet travel cloak and eyed Varasho for a minute, then said softly, I saw them take your father. To the palace. Lena nodded. Varasho spoke quietly. So why are you here? You know it's dangerous to you, and... I know. I can help you. Varasho looked at Lena skeptically. Help me? What exactly can you do to help me? As your father feared, they took him to the dungeons. They would have to. Where else can they keep him out of sight? I can bring you there, unseen. Varasho paused and considered with growing understanding. By way of the servants' quarters. That might be an idea. You have to let me help. Lena reached out and grasped Varasho's hand. Please, Varasho, Logan would have wanted me to. Varasho pulled her close and whispered urgently, You will keep that quiet. I must protect my brother, now more than ever. Lena averted her eyes and Varasho loosened his grip. I'm sorry, Lena, I'm not myself. It's all right, she whispered. Varasho decided to let the conversation go. He turned to Graham and Derek, who were also standing, still fully armed and armored as though awaiting orders. Graham shifted and cleared his throat. My lord, your father was taken some time ago. If we're going to get him back, we can't do it now, interrupted Varasho. We need to rest, all of us. If we try to rescue my father as day is breaking, exhausted and frantic as we are, we'll be more likely to misstep and end up sharing a cell next to him. We also cannot linger too long, said Derek. High Lord Vendile will execute the king as soon as he's able, and then he'll come looking for you. Varasho chuckled. He already thinks I'm dead. He explained Renan's rescue and returned to the palace. Graham stroked his mustache. Well, that gives us a few more allies inside Vendile's nest. We're going to need them, my lord. Varasho murmured his agreement and raised his hand to stall further talk. Rest while there's still light. We act tonight under cover of darkness. Lena, you can stay in my brother's room. You two may use mine, and my father's. Derek tried to reason with the prince. You've ridden all night, my lord. I've just rested. You take your room, and let Graham have a break. I'll wake one of you at midday. We can't be without a watch. Varasho nodded reluctantly. When you wake me, I shall have a plan. Despite his protests, Graham went upstairs with Varasho and was soon fast asleep in Arvadas' bedchamber. Varasho had removed his tunic and was shirtless in his own room, standing in a daze of sleeplessness and worry. He examined the heavy bedposts in his old bed and ran his thumb across the initials he and Logan had carved in them so long ago. It was before Grimtooth had come along, and he begun to lose his kinship with his only brother. The two had been great friends as children, and Verasho had looked out for his younger brother in fear he might be hurt or led astray. It was his conviction, his utter faith in the Anglidaic code, which had broken them apart. Logan was rebellious, adventurous, and he defied conventions of his high-born status, preferring to mill about with the common people. As his father had admired the people, so did Verasho, but Logan identified with them, even loved them as his own family. Verasho protected the people as his subjects, while Logan defended them as though their trials were his own. Verasho understood why he and Grimtooth had become so close. His father admired Logan for his connection to the common folk, and Verasho could not help but resent him for it. With his passion, Logan had won the love of his father, and become the favorite son of the citizenry of Angledeus. By remaining steadfast in his sense of place and duty, Verasho had become ostracized from those he was sworn to defend. Why do you hate it so, your brother's defiance of nobility? Verasho turned to see Lena in his doorway, clad in simple woolen dress of pale blue. He dropped his hand from the bedpost and turned to her. You should be resting, Lena. But Lena did not leave. She stepped in and went to the same bedpost, running her thumb over the initials as Verasho had. She spoke without looking at him. He loves you as much as Grimtooth. You know. He told me. One of the nights at my home. He told me. I don't need you to tell me of my brother's love. Lena shook her head in frustration and turned to Verasho. Yet you do because you do not believe it yourself. He loves you, Verasho, because you have always protected him. Verasho slammed his fist against the wall and shouted, All I've ever protected him from was you. He regained his composure and continued more calmly. The only thing I've done for my brother is shield his reputation. I have not consoled him. I have not bled for him. I am so little his brother he seeks that bond from another. My father would not be imprisoned if Logan were here. He would have smelled the trouble and been there to fight Vendile himself. Lena placed a hand on Verasho's arm, but he jerked it away. She looked at him pleadingly. You acted according to the law, Verasho. Your father knew what was coming, and the people are not blind to Vendile or his cohorts. He did exactly what he wanted. You refused to play the backstabber. There's nothing more you can be expected to do. Verasho leaned on the wall and stared at the floor. Therein lies my fault. As I have always done, I acted according to the code. Logan defied it and became a hero to the people who have kept my father on the throne. Angledeus respects me, yes, but they love my brother. Lena stood close to Verasho and pulled his chin upward so he looked straight into her eyes. I, of all people, know how far your brother has gone in breaking the code, but it does not make him any less ashamed of it. Your code took him away from me, and I cannot forgive it for that. His other offenses were only minor compared to what we did. Verasho simply stared at her. Lena sighed and whispered, Say something at least, something that will make me believe you finally forgave your brother. I forgave him before it even happened. And me. Verasho placed his hand on her shoulder. I never faulted either of you, only myself for not preventing it. Lena looked at him in confusion. For not preventing love. Do you think that's what you had? Yes, we have it still. Verasho stood silent for a moment and considered her words. I think perhaps I blame myself for sending him away. Lena nodded. You were not his brother then. You acted as his superior. I did what the code demanded. I gave him a quest to remove his sin. He does not blame you for it. I treated him like a whoring nobleman. Yet you told no one that it was such a quest. They think he's taking the right. Verasho glanced back at the bedpost. Maybe he is. My brother may come back a paladin. He may live by the code as ardently as I when he returns, but a part of me prays he does not. Lena smiled slightly. Why is that? Verasho returned his gaze to her, saying, Because the Logan that left here was one destined to do great things, but should he change and become as rigid as every noble warrior of our highest rank, well then he shall do only good and just things as dictated by our laws. Lena placed her hand on his face consolingly. And what of you, young prince? What sort of things will you do? I'll do what's right. I'll save my father and my country. Lena smiled and dropped her hand, naturally. She turned to leave, and as she stepped through the doorway, Verasho said, Lena, I know you used your ring to gain entry. What did you tell Derek and Graham? She stopped and eyed the prince over her shoulder. That I was a loyal servant of the house for many years, and that I could be of service to you. I said nothing else. Verasho nodded. Lena walked down the hall and closed Logan's door. He was alone again. Verasho closed his own door softly and examined his room once more. As a child, he had sat in the same bedroom planning the rescue of princesses in distress. Tonight, he would plan something strangely similar. It seemed odd to him that he might be the hero reminiscent of his long-ago imaginings. He had always pictured Logan to be the one completing such feats of legend. Verasho lay down in his bed and wondered where his brother was then. What would he have said about his father's predicament? Verasho laughed softly. He knew what his brother would have done. He would have looked at Grimtooth, then at Verasho, then drawn his sword. Well, he'd remark, I hope there are enough of the villains waiting to satisfy all of us. Verasho could not hold the image in his mind as he drifted off. When sleep overtook him, his smile was gone, and in his mind he was watching Logan ride away from Angledeus, away from the woman he had been told he could not love, the woman he had lain with before she was his wife, and it was not the paladins or the priests sending him into exile. It was his own brother. The code had demanded it. While the area that contained the many small isolated communities of the nation of Nepal was called the Great Northern Waste, the name might have fit better for the region known as the Frozen Reach. The two locales were similar in environment, but the Reach was colder by a significant amount through most of the year and had almost no permanent inhabitants outside of several huddled towns. Even animals avoided the Frozen Reach, if they could, preferring to linger near Whitewood or the mountains. The western side of the Dragon Scales, now being traversed by both the Nepal City refugees and their mad pursuer, was known to the bulls as the Bull of Storms. The Bull was so called for the curvature of its mountains, which trapped the Arctic gusts coming across the north of the Syrian Sea. This made the region incredibly dangerous to travelers, since the visibility, even on a relatively calm day, was typically less than 100 feet. The weather during the stormier days was far more severe. Then visibility shrunk down to inches, if that. Unfortunately for the three fugitives, they had chosen one of the worst times to make their short journey. It was late fall, winds were high, but not wintry enough to freeze those caught in the open, and yet the billowing and blowing made the soft snow into a white curtain that surrounded the three lonely wanderers. For Saltillan, things would have been much the same, but his madness had awoken a sort of latent sixth sense. He needed no footprints to follow, nor did he need the keen nose of the Daemon wolf, Kurok. Saltillan was certain of his path, so he hardly glanced up from his feet, shuffling steadily forward through the increasingly higher drifts of snow. The meeting with Kurok had gone well. The beast had sensed the summoner's madness and immediately felt confident it could have managed the situation if things became counter to its liking. A hunt had perked the monster's interest. It had not tasted fresh blood in many years, but the summoning guaranteed at least one kill. The demands of the pitiful mortal who had summoned it had been needlessly detailed. Do not touch the girl. Wound the tall elf with the green eyes, but only enough that he cannot flee. Kill the other if you like. Kurok did not care why the mage had summoned him or what sort of vendetta he had against the three. The demonic beast would have certainly killed the third for sport, and probably the others if it felt ravenous enough. The wizard's instructions be damned. Then it thought it might go south and terrorize a few villages. It had been too long since Kurok had fed on the weak peoples of Tethtanir, and in his awakening he now remembered the rush of adrenaline he felt when he killed each victim. It was time, and he was ready. Edge slogged through the knee-deep snow in the lead, despite his injury. His youth and strength had overcome his wounded leg. It was stiff, but the snow made him move stiffly anyway, so he hardly noticed. Roman was bringing up the rear as best he could, theoretically trying to keep Raymir on pace. They had moved like this for 5 days, Edge breaking the pack snow in front, the others following in his wake. Roman had taken the lead a few times to relieve him, but for the most part, the grim lost elf held the point. Edge kept a methodic plod, stabbing forward with the heavy shaft of his halberd and then driving his legs one at a time behind to meet it. His hood would not stay on, and his tender pointed ears were chilled beyond feeling. Raymir kept her eyes down and did her best to stay on the worn sections of Edge's path. Roman's head remained up, and he would replace his hood each time it fell while making sure she stayed steadily on the path. Sometimes Edge glanced back to make sure Raymir wasn't dragging too much. If he believed she was, he would slacken his pace or call a brief rest. At night they had been forced to stop and carve out a small hole under the snow to keep warm. Edge's long halberd served as a marker for when they had to dig themselves clear in the morning. Speed was key. Once on the mountain, there would be less exposure to a potential storm, which thankfully had not yet arisen. Edge was counting on a slowed pace to give them time to recover before they had to venture onto open ground again. The winds would be worse in the mountain, but cover would be more readily available amid the rocks. At least that was the hope. Roman was more concerned about making it to the mountain at all. He had kept close watch on Raymir and knew the travel was wearing on her as much as it did him, but for all the Lost Elf's determination, Edge was faring the worst. He had an injured leg and he was largely ignoring, but Roman had seen his gait slow. He knew about the occasional slackening of pace for Raymir, but she was fine. Edge's own pace had been dying down since yesterday, and it made Roman fear that he was pushing his injury too hard and fast. Roman saw a stumble through the billowing snow and stopped his own movement. Edge, maybe we should... Roman froze. He could not explain it, but he felt something behind him. Down, he shouted, over the shrieking wind. Roman dove forward, taking Raymir towards the earth with him while he also moving off the path Edge had made. Raymir yelled something he could not hear, but both felt a rush of air pass where they had been standing. He heard Edge grunt and saw him fall as something struck him and moved on at an impossible speed. Edge heard Roman shout, but only turned in time to see some kind of strange form leap out of the swirling white. It smashed into Edge's side and sent him spinning off the path and into the snow. Edge was stunned, but Roman reacted quickly. He hauled himself up and drew his sword, peering into the driving white flakes. Raymir was up as well and rushing to Edge's side. Roman called out to them both, "Can you see it?" Edge heaved himself up to hands and knees just as Raymir arrived next to him. "I'm okay, really." Roman kept turning from side to side, trying to spot whatever had attacked them. Something darted past his left shoulder and he spun swiftly, but he saw nothing. Edge had grabbed his halberd and was starting to heave himself back up when he caught sight of something hurtling towards Raymir and him. Acting quickly, he shoved Raymir away and tried to hop aside to avoid whatever was coming. Edge was dealt a glancing blow, but remained upright, if teetering a bit. Roman saw the attack and without thinking swung his sword low in a sweeping arc. The thing ripped past him, but Roman felt his blade bite into flesh and heard an unearthly howl as the beast blew by and rolled, crashing into the snow, just within his field of vision. Roman looked over his shoulder and saw Edge trying to stumble towards him. He turned back in time to see the beast get up. It was massive, almost 5 feet wide at its shoulders and at least 6 feet in height. It moved on all fours, but wasn't close enough for Roman to make out any other distinguishing features. Even in the obscuring flood of driving white, he felt a tingle of fear and hysteria creep up his spine. This thing was not of this world. The creature had righted itself and began moving in a low, crouched stalk towards the 3 battered figures. Roman took a step back, and then froze as the creature became more clearly visible. "Alanormir, protect me," he whispered. Raymir had regained her feet and looked up, gasping in horror. "What is that?" Edge was moving far more quickly now, the pain secondary to his desperation to protect the other 2. With his halberd gripped in both hands and cocked back for a heavy swing, he called out, "Raymir, get behind me!" But the girl was frozen. "Get behind me!" yelled Edge, again. Raymir moved, but then stopped as the monster before them became more clearly visible through a lull in the winds. The creature was hideous. It had gray and black fur that looked singed and stood out in sharp, jagged tufts across its body. The wild hairs covered only some of its form. The rest was devoid of skin or hair and was pulsing red like a beating heart. It had fearsome claws as long as Roman's sword blade and a monstrous maw of teeth, with its snarling dark lips curled back to reveal far too many of them. What captivated Roman most were the thing's eyes. They were white with red veins, but no pupils, just vein-streaked orbs of madness. It crept a little closer in a slinking crouch, blood dripping from its foreleg where Roman had wounded it. "Do not resist, fools. Just let this be, and you will not suffer." Edge hissed at Roman. "Is it talking?" Roman grunted in disbelief. "In our minds. He does not want the girl harmed." Roman was confused. "He?" Raymir clapped her hands to her mouth in horror. "Saltillion." "How did he find us?" Roman said. "I don't know," murmured Edge. Then he spoke to the creature. "Leave here, beast. I have no quarrel with you." A strange vibration went through Edge's mind. He realized the thing was laughing. It reminded him of a wolf, but also a bear, like some nightmare combination mixed with other horrors he could not fathom. Raymir's thought entered Edge's own. What was this thing? "I am a daemon, young elf, and I am only the beginning." With that, the monster reared up and let loose a blood-curdling howl that caused his foes to recoil. Roman had recovered and stood his ground, twirling his sword in anticipation. Edge shuffled his position to the left of his companion, giving himself full range to swing. The creature landed on all fours with a snarl and lunged at Roman with one of its titanic claws. Roman leaned back as the talons streaked past his face, narrowly avoiding his flesh. The creature then leapt at Edge before completing its first swing, catching the young man off guard. He threw his haft up to deflect the blow and was knocked stumbling backward as the monster landed it with his weight against his weapon. Raymir began chanting almost without thinking and extended her hand towards the creature. Flames leapt out from her fingertips, uncontrolled, knocking her back as well, but the flare scorched the creature and drove it away from Edge. Kurok was caught unawares. It had expected the men to be dangerous, but the female was a surprise. She should not have been a threat, for Kurok would have sensed the magical spark in her had it been greater. That explained why she could not control the spell she unleashed to defend the elf, but it had still done Kurok harm. Burned and in pain, the beast roared in anger and flexed its powerful muscles. Shaking off the attack, it tried to regroup against the fallen lost elf and take him out of the fight, but the annoyingly durable human had come and placed himself between Kurok and its target. Roman spread his legs so as to set a base and waited for the thing to attack. He could not see if Raymir was moving, but she had been knocked high and far by the blast she had let fly at the beast. Fortunately, it at least seemed hurt by her explosive burst of magic energy. He had doubted, upon first seeing it in all its horror, and despite his lucky slash to its leg, that they could even harm the abomination. Its fur was singed to go along with several hanging flaps of blackened flesh. Surely it would have slowed somewhat. Roman could feel the burning anger of the monster as it eyed him and gathered to strike. He tried to preempt the assault, swinging for its shoulder. The blow landed, but the thing did not seem to notice as it backhanded Roman and sent him flying almost 20 feet into the snow. Roman landed hard and tried to regroup immediately, but his legs nearly buckled as he rose. The blow had shaken him, and the creature was already closing the gap. Roman just managed to stand and tried to bring up his guard, but the beast snarled and batted his blade away. It went spinning in the snow, and Roman tried to make a grab for it, but the beast struck him with its shoulder. Roman went down, and the thing moved over him, its fangs a mere foot from his face, jowls dripping with saliva. It reared back, and Roman knew he could do nothing to stop the killing blow, when suddenly Edge's halberd struck the thing in its side. Kurok spun, in howling spasms of fury and pain. It had been intent on its victim and had not seen the other male recover and make a desperate swing to save his friend. The monster had felt its ribs broken under the force of the blow. Once again it had underestimated its enemy. The lost elf was incredibly strong and shockingly resilient. Edge wrenched backward and pulled the halberd blade free of the creature's hide, steadying himself as the thing writhed and turned to face him. Edge used his weapon like a spear, thrusting the point at his foe to back it away from Roman's prostrate form. Karak was at a loss. The girl appeared to be unconscious after releasing her spell, and it had battered the two warriors enough to know they were hurting, but the lost elf had wounded it severely. Karak was considering whether or not to flee before it became more seriously injured. Then it saw the human crawling toward its sword. Feinting to Edge's right, Karak turned the quick clawing jab into a lunge to its left. The lurching motion exposed Karak's wounded side, but it was intent on taking out at least one adversary. Roman saw the beast turn for him, but stayed focused on his sword. Once he had the hilt, he immediately swung upward in a curving arc. Unprepared for such a sudden motion, Karak caught the blade directly in its face. The strike sliced across its muzzle and through its left eye. Karak spun away in rage and pain, flailing about madly. It tried to regain a sense of its location, but its good eye refused to cooperate. The pain blinded Karak completely, and it never saw Edge's overhead chop that split its skull, putting an end to the fight forever. Unnaturally dark blood exploded from the ruined head of the monster. Flecks landed on Edge's cloak and face as the lost elf stood over his kill, breathing hard. Roman looked up from his place in the snow at the young man as he tried to recover his wits. Heaving himself up, he surveyed the chaos of their battlefield. Blood soaked most of the ground around them, and the beast's body was massive even as it lay prostrate in the soft snow. Roman stood and tested his legs for stability. He felt pain all over, but that did not surprise him. He'd not been slashed, thank the gods. If he had, he was certain he'd already be dead. Edge released the haft of his weapon and fell hard in the snow. Roman caught him in time to keep him in a sitting position. The youth leaned against him. "I owe you again." "We're even, Roman." Roman glanced at the body. "That's not my blade in that thing's head." "A lucky swing." Despite himself, Roman laughed loudly and helped Edge to stand. "Can you walk?" Edge gritted his teeth but nodded as he gained some balance. Roman moved quickly to Raymir's side as she began to gingerly rise, and checked her hands for injuries. She held them out, and despite the torrent of fire she invoked, they were unharmed. Against her protest, the man from Hethgar hefted her arm over his shoulder, just as Edge gave a sharp intake of breath. "Roman, look." Roman turned slowly and saw Edge holding his bloody weapon, watching the body of the creature turn slowly to ash and collapse into a pile of dust. The blood on Edge's blade dried and fell away as well, like water being soaked up in a desert. Roman held his own bared blade up for inspection and noted the same strange effect. Edge hobbled over to him but kept his eyes on Raymir. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Raymir said unconvincingly. "Just a bit dazed by the blast. Sometimes that happens when you use a spell you're unfamiliar with." "Where did you learn to do that?" "I don't remember." Edge nodded wearily in acceptance. "I had no idea you were capable of something that powerful." Roman patted Raymir's hand hanging over his chest. "I doubt she knew it herself. You saved us, young squaw." "She would," said Edge proudly, then surveyed their position and grew serious. "We need to move." Raymir was close to fainting, and Roman convinced her to let him sling her across his back and be carried for a time. He adjusted her body across his shoulders, saying, "Let's get as far as possible before we need to rest. Saltillion is clearly tracking us, somehow." The two turned and began slogging their way north toward Mount Iceblade. As they plodded off, Edge suddenly thought of something the monster had mentioned, about being only the beginning. He looked briefly over his shoulder back at the hole in the spinning snow the body had left, and terrible images came to his mind. What if there were really more of these things, somewhere? Edge pulled his cloak tighter about him, for the wind suddenly seemed much colder. Saltillion felt the death of Karak minutely through his medallion, but he held no real sway over his thoughts or plans. He did not slow nor increase his pace, for in the spinning of his twisted thoughts he understood where his quarry was going. Mount Iceblade was nearby, and if they had chosen to go north, there could only be one place they saw it. Saltillion had kept careful record of Deavron's contacts. Anything he mentioned, even in passing, was filed away and later written down for permanent documentation. There was only one reason they could be moving north instead of fleeing south to relative safety. They had uncovered the same mystery that the Mad Wizard had. Raymir had worked in the library at Castle Bane, where Saltillion had browsed the many texts for hours on end. He had the run of the place for the most part, as Deavron insisted that the majority of Nepal's tombs were of no interest to him. His arrogance had allowed Saltillion to openly research this mysterious structure called Twisted Spire, a name uncovered in one of his furtive explorations of Deavron's personal notes. All Saltillion's labors had allowed one rare slip to reveal so much, but it seemed he had not been the only one spying on his fellow mage. He knew by now that Raymir had likely found his own carelessly scattered notes in the library. Only she would have been able to see them. The servants never lingered long on the levels set aside for the wizard's use. Saltillion had underestimated her potential. He had not known she was capable of magic, but through his connection to the daemon he understood she had wielded a significant enough incantation to wound the creature. Saltillion's lust had only increased, and now his plans changed. He wanted Raymir to see his arcane might was nigh infinite in comparison to her own. More importantly, He wanted her to understand only he could unlock her potential. The others in her life were worthless. Twisted Spire was important to the war effort, but even Saltillion did not know why. He had already concluded that Wolfbane knew nothing of it either, making it of even greater importance. His quarry was looking for it as well, and perhaps they thought Mount Iceblade would give them an ideal vantage point to try and spot it. Saltillion would let them get up the mountain, and allow them to waste more energy. Karak must have injured the men, at the very least. He would let time weaken them further. Once they reached the height they sought, Saltillion would strike.